All ergonomists who are dealing in research, they have to go through one or the different kind of epidemiological studies where they have to find out the relationship between the cause and effect, relationship between exposure and outcome. For example, the exposure may be awkward posture. For example, the exposure may be the unnecessary load or the level of the force. For example, the exposure may be the frequency of exertion. So all these exposures may account for the discomfort, and that may lead to the development of what we call, a very common term in ergonomics is work related musculoskeletal disorders. Synonym to it is are repetitive strain injury, repetitive motion injuries, cumulative trauma disorders. So all these are basically the outcomes which are dependent upon the case. Cases are the persons who are exposed to situation where the task is, for example, overhead welding, overhead drilling. So in that case, the shoulder is exposed to awkward posture. For example, the cutting, the manual cutting of the GI sheet. So the exertion, the force level. For example, punching and packaging. So the frequency is an awkward thing. So in all those kind of epidemiological studies where we have to develop, or we have to find out the prevalence of the factors responsible for, or the exposure responsible for the development of outcome, which is nothing but WMSDs. So in this case, we have to find out the incidence and we have to find out the prevalence of the exposure. So when we talk about prevalence of exposure, there are certain things which are important. Let's take a problem. Occupational medical health and safety officer in an ice cream factory has exposed you as an ergonomist or epidemiologist to carry out an investigation of shoulder pain in the shop floor worker. This problem is taken from Bridges' book of Introduction to Ergonomics. So we are acknowledging them for creating so many problems for understanding the basic concept of ergonomics. In this problem, what we have to do is we have to find out the incidence. We have to find out whether the awkward posture, the persons exposed to awkward posture are getting shoulder pain or not. The person who is not exposed to awkward posture, whether they are getting the shoulder pain or not. So if we develop that kind of data in which we have the odd exposure, like exposure and outcome. So we have to develop whether there is a shoulder pain or yes or no, whether there is an exposure or not. So if exposure is there and we are getting the values, for example, out of the 1,000 workers who are given that particular task and they are exposed to awkward shoulder or exposure and they are getting shoulder pain, suppose there are 50, there may be, let's have the person having no shoulder pain with the awkward posture, maybe for example 50 again. There may be some persons who are not exposed to awkward posture but getting still the shoulder pain, they may be 5. There may be persons who are not exposed to shoulder awkward posture but not getting the pain. So that may be, for example, more. So the total number who are exposed to that particular factory is nothing but 205. So out of 205, we have to find out certain parameters which could be indicative for certain kind of relationship between exposure and outcome. So the terminology required for assessment is exposure, situation, prevalence, whether there is a relationship of how many persons are prevalent to that particular situation, incidence, occurrence of the situation, outcome, maybe WMSDs or shoulder pain or wrist pain, or for example, typists are exposed to carpal tunnel disorder. So there are cases, how many cases you are assessing. When we talk about all this and we look back to our table, which we were roughly generating a table, so in that case there are certain statistical parameters which you generally find in many researches, many studies which are very important to understand what they are. Sometimes our students, MTech and BTech and research students, when they start reading literature, they come across the term OR, RR, PR, so they are confused. How do they calculate it? These are very simple procedures to calculate these terms, which are known as odd ratio, prevalence ratio, relative risk. Odd ratio is nothing but the exposure outcome with the given exposure situation with respect to the outcome which is not showing the kind of WMSDs. So with respect to the situation when we are getting pain without exposure with respect to no pain without exposure. So this is a ratio of ratio of getting pain with the exposure with respect to the ratio of getting pain without exposure. So for example, if we draw a table for exposure versus outcome. This was shoulder pain, yes, no. Exposure of odd posture, yes, no. So if we are getting the values as 50, 50, 500, in that case, if we call it A, if we call it B, C and D. So what we are going to have odd ratio, it is nothing but odd ratio is the ratio of prevalence of occurrence of injuries with respect to exposure upon prevalence of occurrence of injuries with respect to no exposure. So that is A upon B with respect to C upon D. So that is what is called as odd ratio. Now if we call upon what is the prevalence ratio. So prevalence ratio is nothing but all outcomes which are prevalence to that particular situation. So prevalence ratio is nothing but the situation which we are getting as all the outcomes which are accountable for shoulder pain with respect to the total exposures, total cases. So it will be nothing but A plus C upon A plus B plus C plus D. So this is our prevalence ratio. When we talk about relative risk, so relative risk is a situation where we want to see whether there is a risk of exposure or risk of no exposure. So what is the risk involved in exposure is nothing but A upon A plus B with respect to C upon C plus D. So that is a relative risk. So these three terms are very important for understanding, because most of the researches we do find these terms in the manuscript repeatedly occurring, and then comparing this situation with other situations before ergonomic interventions and after the ergonomic interventions in a particular task, and then people do find the kind of situation where the ergonomic interventions are helping to improve these factors or not. Now we can see this problem. This is an example of what we had discussed right now. Now see this problem. This is an example what we had discussed right now. Occupational medical health or safety officer in an ice cream factory has asked you if you are an ergonomic, you are in health and safety engineer or officer, carry out an investigation of shoulder pain. When you made a survey of 125 persons exposed or non-exposed to high shelf and their shoulder pain relationship, we want you to comment on that. After assessing the task, now your next step will be, your step 1 is to collecting the data. Once you collect the data, you can find out the parameters which are known as odd ratio, prevalence ratio, relative risk. When we talk about all these three things, we have to go for what is odd ratio. Odd ratio is when there is an exposure and a pain with respect to exposure and no pain. about with relative to no exposure and pain with no exposure and no pain, which we call as A upon B relative to C upon. If you see this, we are going to have 20 upon 20 divided by 5 upon 80. So the relative risk is nothing but 80 upon 5, which is 160. So the odd ratio may go from 0 to infinity, but if it is more than 1, it is showing a kind of uh, relationship, kind of relationship of the occurrence. So that is it means that we have to take into account that there is a relationship of the uh, the exposure to odd situation to the odd outcome. Now, if we have to find out the prevalence rate, so the prevalence rate is nothing but the total person exposed or not exposed when they were exposed and having a pain plus when they were not exposed and having a pain, which is nothing but A plus C divided by this is divided by the total cases. So the total cases were nothing but A plus B plus C plus D. The prevalence is nothing but 20 plus 5 divided by 125. So that is 1 upon 5. So the prevalence is slightly low in this case. That prevalence is 20%. So 20% people are getting pain in such situation. Now the third parameter was relative risk. Relative risk is risk due to exposure and risk without exposure. So in this case, A divided by A plus B divided by C divided by C plus D. So A is nothing but having pain when exposed, B is nothing but having no pain when exposed, C is having pain without exposure, and D is having no pain without no exposure. So that will be 20 divided by 25 divided by 5 divided by 85. So that is about what we can say is 20 into 85 divided by 5 into 25. So that will be 170, 700 divided by. So the relative risk is 13.6. It means the risk of exposure is high. Risk of exposure is. The application of these parameters are very important for the research point of view. Most of the research papers, either you see the Journal of Ergonomics, Industrial Ergonomics, Applied Ergonomics, Occupational Safety, you'll find these parameters very important. Now, what we can do there, we can make ergonomic interventions, reducing the shelf height, providing the trolleys, providing the support so that the shoulder may not go to the Oxford posture. And after that, we can again perform the cases. When we will perform the case study, again we will find out these parameters, either odd ratio, prevalence ratio, or relative risk, and we can compare them. During the comparisons, we can implement the statistical methods to compare, either using chi-square test if it is a non-parametric values, or t-test if they are parametric values. So in that way, we can understand these parameters and implement for many epidemiological studies, whether it is a typing work, dentistry work, or any kind of odd exposures to ergonomic risk factors. Thank you.